It often happens with a group of people hiding behind couches or in the shadows, shushing one another in anticipation of the big moment. For some reason, the shushing always seems to go on longer than it should. There's always somebody who's trying to finish their joke or their story, or there's usually someone in the room who is a little loud, hasn't quite yet learned how to whisper, and no one knows how to tell them about that. But eventually, the room goes still, and the sounds of the approaching victim of honor arrives. Now, with loud and awkward code words being said by the guests of honor's designated Virgil, the doors opened, lights are turned on, and everyone jumps out of their position yelling, "Surprise!" If the person being surprised survives, then usually much merriment and glad tidings ensue. That is, after the shock wears off and they begin breathing again on their birthday or anniversary or whatever the occasion happens to be. Our gospel reading this morning, like Dolores said, tells of a big surprise experienced by two people walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Our text is Luke 24, verses 13 through 35, and the gospel reads, "Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, 'What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?' They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, 'Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place here in these days?' He asked them, 'What things?' They replied, 'The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were there with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him.' Then he said to them, 'Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?' Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them these things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on, but they urged him strongly, saying, 'Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over.' So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?' That very hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, 'The Lord has risen indeed, and he's appeared to Simon.' Then they told what happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread." This is the word of the Lord. The sun came up that morning in the sky, but it didn't rise in their hearts. They were crushed and confused about all they had seen. The victor didn't win. The king wasn't just left uncrowned, he was humiliated and mocked with a crown of thorns. All morning long, they were simply going through the motions, mindlessly gathering their things, getting dressed through pure muscle memory, only able to do it this morning because they'd done it so many times before. They moved their food around in silence because there were no words to be spoken. They'd all fallen away when they heard the prophet and would-be king cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" They were leaving Jerusalem, and as they walked out of the house and onto the road, the sound of their shuffling feet finally gave way to the first comment as one confused follower said to the other, "I don't understand." He was different. He spoke with authority. He'd gotten out of tight places before, but now he's dead. They drifted back into their silence. The weight of these images and the devastating blow of disillusionment all but sucking the very air from their lungs, they walked toward a place called Emmaus. It was just far enough from Jerusalem to give them some perspective. It didn't mean much to them. It was a place to go when you had no place to go. So they walked. Then a stranger sidled up to them. Quiet at first, he just walked with them until after a while, one of the disciples realized they were so lost in being lost that they were being a little rude. He didn't have the stomach for pleasantries, so he simply nodded towards the stranger in a wordless hello. The stranger responded, "I heard you talking earlier as I was walking up, and, well, not to be intruding, but it sounded important. Is something going on?" They stopped walking, stood still for a minute, both hoping the other one would respond and wishing the stranger would simply drop the question and they could keep walking along in their days. That gave way to irritation in one of them who said, "Really? Are you the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know what happened the last few days?" The stranger looked interested in hearing the story. So he replied, "What happened?" And then the disciple began to report about Jesus of Nazareth, how he was a prophet. Not just the kind who talks a lot. He was a prophet who was real. He did things, mighty things, and even the way he spoke, it was different. It was real too. It was prophetic, but that's redundant. So he's telling this guy about Jesus and how they had such hope that he was really the one. But then our leaders and our chief priests handed him over, and now he's dead. He was their hope, but he's dead, and their hope seemed to be nailed to that same cross. So, well, they're walking. The stranger chastises them a little. It begins this unpacking of Scripture to reveal to them, to prove to them, to explain to them how this is all a part of the plan, how it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer in this way, and that far from being slow of heart about these things, they should be alert. They should be on edge, in fight or flight mode, because real change is happening in the world. When we put ourselves in the story with the two followers, it's easy to relate. We've all experienced devastation of some kind. The doctor walks into the room and says those words you couldn't ever imagine hearing. And her voice begins to fade out as your mind spins and your stomach churns like you're on a nightmare tilt-a-whirl at a low-budget carnival, and your shocked heart begins to slow down. You've got the bills all laid out on the kitchen table, and you realize you can't make it work. It's a puzzle you cannot solve, and suddenly the things that were once acts of kindness and grace between you and your spouse, in the replay now they feel like weapons of financial destruction used to bludgeon your dreams and trap you both into this pit of despair. And as you look across the table at the person who for so long has always made your heart quicken, now you look over and your heart begins to slow down. Or you recognize that opportunities you thought you would come to fruition at some point later on in life have now passed you by, and they will not return. And with each new limitation, each realization that you cannot do something you had done easily in the past, each new discovery that this particular ship has sailed and will not return to a harbor you can access, your heart, that heart that once grew excited with anticipation of the unknown, now begins to slow down. We feel dizzy and numb, like we're moving about in a walking coma, unable to feel anything because we can't stop feeling everything. Beverly Eckert lost her husband in the tragedy on 9/11. He was in one of the towers on the 105th floor, and after frantically searching for an escape route, he called his wife. They spent 30 minutes on the phone talking to one another. She recounted her story on NPR's Storyboard, and in it she says, "I think about that last half hour with Sean all the time. I remember how I didn't want that day to end. Terrible as it was, I didn't want to go to sleep because as long as I was awake, it was still a day that I'd shared with Sean." He kissed her goodbye that morning before going to work, and she said, "I could still say this was just a little while ago. It was only this morning." We want time to stand still until we've had a chance to get our bearings, but it doesn't. These two knew this as they shuffled along the road to Emmaus, and even the exegesis from the Word himself couldn't rattle them back to reality. Their hearts were slow, still reeling from the destruction of their hope. It can take a while for the heart to speed back up, to recover its normal operating rhythm, but something else was happening inside those slow hearts. A warmth was beginning to grow as the stranger talked to them about the promises of God, and the embers were fanned into tiny flames that began to grow stronger and stronger. And they invite this blessed stranger to stay with them, and he sits down, and the guest becomes the host. He takes the bread, he blesses it, and breaks it, and gives it to them. And when he did, the epiphany was undeniable. God was with them. Surprise. Are our hearts burning within us this day? Is this kind of heavenly heartburn a part of our daily living such that we have a giddy expectation that there will be a surprise around the corner, a lightning bolt of new light and new life? When we go out from this place and we listen to our children, really hear their voices and get into their perspective on the world, do their questions fan the embers in our hearts and lead us to discover again wonders that had once surprised our souls but have long since grown cold? Do our hearts burn within us as we open ourselves up to feeding the hungry, and in the midst of sharing our lives and our resources, as we bless the bread and break it together? Surprise! God is here in ways we didn't see before. These people who are receiving our food have much to teach us about our illusions of control and the building of bigger barns. Do our hearts burn within us when we sit and listen to the dear old saint in the assisted living place, telling us the same story over and over again? as we hear their souls come singing forth in the rhythm and repetition of their lives, can we feel the common loaf between us? And will we take it up and bless it and break it and share it and find, surprise, God is here. There is a wonderfully submissive posture about being a person who lives into the paradox of expecting a surprise. It conveys well our belief in a God who is bigger than our understanding, in a Son who is more gracious than our comprehension, and in a Spirit who is alive and moving in and through our lives. I like that in the story, the other person isn't named. It leaves an opening in this place that while it's a remarkable and fantastic story, it's not unlike ours. We too have spent a great deal of time in our lives studying the Scriptures. We have some moments of recognition, some epiphanies in our lives when we realize God's presence. Our ears are opened and we hear the tongues of flame rushing out to new areas of grace. Our eyes are opened and we see in new colors and shapes and in vivid detail we hadn't known before. We don't know the other traveler's name, which is nice because it leaves room for your name and for my name. We also don't know if Cleopas and the other person went on to be faithful followers. We know that Cleopas isn't heard from again, and we assume that if the other person had been, that his name would have found its way into our text, which seems odd because, well, this experience, it's a big deal. It seems like it should be used on the next superstar of the church, Jesus. Jesus unpacks the Scriptures for them. He uses his limited time between resurrection and ascension to appear to these two wandering souls. And you might think that with this kind of experience, they would go on to be prominent leaders of the early church, the next Peter and James, the next Paul and Barnabas. They do hurry back to tell the disciples, but after that, we don't know what became of them. We don't know if this profound experience with the risen Christ transformed them into lifelong devotees of the way, or did it wear off after a while and they simply drifted into distraction like we are so prone to do. This powerful epiphany, this remarkable moment of recognition, this discovery of grace and God's presence, and well, we don't know what happened in the lives of these two followers. We don't know what will happen in the life of our church and this gathering of followers. We don't know what will happen in our lives. And will this change us or not? And therein lies our next surprise. Amen.